Hey there, welcome back to the Flex Diet Podcast. And today, on a new episode, I've got my good buddy Rick Alexander. I work with him on the Special Forces experience. We got to hang out with everyone else from the SFE in Costa Rica this past year in January for kind of a group meeting mastermind. So it was super awesome to spend more time with him. I would highly recommend you also check out his podcast too, which is just Morning Coffee with Rick Alexander. His Instagram is awesome. He's got lots of really great quotes there. We talk a little bit about his background in the first part of the episode, but I wanted to give you more background on him since he's doesn't say a whole lot about himself and he's done some really cool stuff. He's an author, a speaker, educator, specializing in helping individuals and organizations understand themselves better so they can increase performance, find meaning in their work, and build a life that is in alignment with their ultimate goals. He is also a former member of the Naval Special Operations community, as well as an ultra-endurance athlete. He talks in here about his run he did of 200 miles, which is just crazy. So, yeah, definitely check him out. And his book is awesome. We talk about that too. His latest one, there'll be a link in here to it. I liked it so much, I bought it for all of my online one-on-one clients and sent it to them. Really good. So, in the podcast today with Rick, we talk about transitions and looking at your nervous system from a lens of parasympathetic, which is more rest and relaxation, to sympathetic, more of the stress side. And how do you transition back and forth between those two? There's a lot of talk of people needing to downregulate, relax, get more on the parasympathetic side. So we talk about why that's important, why you want to be able to transition between these points. To me, if you get stuck in either one, that's not going to be very good for performance or just your life in general, body comp, pretty much any goal that you want to achieve. And Rick gives us some really great tools on how to downregulate more, how to do faster transitions, and some really great stories too. So this podcast is brought to you by the Physiologic Flexibility Cert. A big portion of what we talk about in the Physiologic Flexibility Cert is how does things like oxygen and CO2 and other homeostatic regulators, how do they affect your performance? Everything from changes in temperature, pH, as I mentioned, breathing related things. So Rick gives some really good tips on what type of breathing to do. We talk about meditation as a tool also. So the Physiologic Flexibility Cert, you can get more info on that at physiologicflexibility.com. Right now we're releasing in around quarterly. So if you're pretty good with your nutrition and exercise, you're trying to figure out what is the next level to increase your recovery, to be a more robust, anti-fragile human, be more resilient to stressors of all forms, that's what I would recommend, and that's why we created the course. So check out this great interview here with Rick Alexander. Cool, so we're here on the Flex Diet Podcast, my buddy Rick Alexander. Thank you so much for being on here today. Really appreciate it, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to have a conversation.
Yeah, so we're going to get into the topic today, which is how do you kind of transition between more of a parasympathetic, rest and relax, to a sympathetic state, and then kind of back again, right? So what do those spectrum ends look like? What do those transitions look like? Which I know some you've used a lot in your life. And for people who may not be familiar with us, give us a little background on yourself, because you have a very super interesting background.
Super interesting.
That's a
Yeah.
good thing.
Yeah. So it's interesting in the sense that I don't consider myself a master in anything, but I've certainly experientially been a lot of places. So I spent 12 years in the military in a special operations capacity. actually became a special operations combat medic, which was really cool because it was a time where I got to really marry my interest in the human body and also the service that I was into at the time. And since getting out, which was 2 or 3 years ago now, I really stepped full time into being an author and a speaker. I tend to write and think a lot and talk a lot about psychological concepts that have been really helpful, useful in my time in my life. And then I also work for the Special Forces experience as the chief of growth. And really, all that means is we take a lot of time to think, how can we put people in experiences that are going to stretch them psychologically, physiologically, and also while stressing them, give them the tools that help them adapt to that stress and come out with some sort of internal growth. So that's kind of the bulk of what I spend my time on now.
Awesome. And you are also a student again.
Yeah, that's right. I am a student. We'll see. I'm kind of in between being a student right now, but yeah, I've been in a master's program for a while, and really interested in studying psychology, and we'll see where that goes.
Very cool. Very cool. And I think just related to the Special Forces experience, we had a team meeting down in Costa Rica, which was just amazing, super awesome. And I think one of the things that gets kind of glossed over with that is people hear, military hear a lot of stress, and there's a lot of talk about, PTSD, PTS, and for good reason. But there also can be, potentially PTG, like post-traumatic growth, which I don't think really gets talked about enough. It always seems to be more of the negative side. Do you want to just speak to that briefly in terms of that concept? Because it's probably newer to most people.
Yeah, I think it's something that's starting to gain a little bit of steam.
Yes.
So there's a few different ways we could talk about it, right? In some sense, post-traumatic stress, well, PTSD especially, we have a tendency in our culture to diagnose people, and then that becomes their label that they
Right.
sort of live by, right? So in some sense, I think what we're really doing is hopefully widening people's aperture on what they think that this stress has done to them and how it's affecting them, and giving them the tools so that these experiences can be helpful rather than diminishing, rather than take from you, right? And so yeah, I think what's true is true on multiple levels of analysis, right? So just like in your work, when we stress the body, right, there's stress that becomes not helpful at all. There's also stress that, if done incrementally, and if the thing that is being stressed can be inoculated to it, you actually can grow from that stress, right? So the same is true psychologically as it is physiologically. And so I think really just opening people's aperture, having the conversation about the way that this stress impacts our body and affects us. And then further, I think when it comes to post-traumatic stress or growth specifically, it really has to do with the way in which you interact with that stress, like the disposition that you take toward it, right? Like you and I had a conversation for the Special Forces experience, I think it was for a podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked a bit in the midst of the pandemic. We talked a lot about the ways in which we can adapt to stress. And I really don't see much of a difference psychologically and physiologically. It's you. It depends on you, right? It depends on the way that you view what you're going through. And also, too, really learning how trauma can be trapped in the body, learning, you know, I would say really just gaining the tools and understanding how stress affects you can do a lot in helping you grow through it, as opposed to being victimized by it, right? Because oftentimes what happens is we have these symptoms, and when we do, we feel as though we're the victim of these symptoms. And actually, I found that it can be helpful to be like, well, actually what you're experiencing is a symptom of this, and here's why. And then it kind of puts the ball back in your court, kind of empowers you to realize, well, what do I want to do with this, right?
Yeah. So I think we're both in agreement that education, just like all things, is probably a good thing. And do you think that education beforehand may potentially mitigate some of the downsides from a traumatic event?
Totally. This is a conversation that's taking place right now, whether or not, you can retroactively grow
Right.
from experiences. I think that you can, right? I mean, I would say that that's probably the chief goal of therapy, hopefully. But gaining the tools prior to the stress is always going to be more beneficial, I think. Yeah,
Yeah. Great book is I always think of Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score. It's a
totally.
pretty tough read. Like I've started it and stopped it I don't know how many times because until you get through the halfway point, it's just really heavy.
Yeah, the
But
audiobook I would recommend. I think it's a little easier.
easier. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, but he talks a lot about just different traumatic events, and I've done some hands-on stuff with people. Not necessarily, I'm not looking to treat their trauma or anything like that, but once you start interacting with the body in different ways, like things just come up, and a lot of times it's a weird thing for having experienced it myself and watching someone else go through it because they can feel what's going on, especially kind of the resolution, but a lot of times cognitively it's just hard to explain. So I think there's kind of this two-way street between the trauma is kind of stored in the body in that position, and then also how we interact with it. 'Cause like you said, we can think about it in different times. We can think about it in the future, what we may do because of it now. We can think about what happened in the past. You can think of it kind of in the present at the same time too.
Totally. And really, I think one thing I really got from his work is just the idea that, life is inherently traumatizing. Like we are
Yeah.
overwhelmed often. And what I think a lot of people would be surprised about is that, and I don't want to give a stat here because I'm not 100% sure about it, but a large percentage of people that come out of the military with some sort of post-traumatic stress, they went into the military with a decent amount of stress. And actually what happened in the military is they gave them an environment where the way that they had learned to cope with stress actually it actually just like kind of lifted them up, right? Like they were able to be rewarded for their coping mechanism, so to speak, in the military. And then I certainly experienced this. And then you get out and you realize that the way that you've been living is like absolutely untenable. And then you have to start like asking the hard questions of like, man, where did this start showing up for me? How do I deal with overwhelm? And then the most important part, which is how do I start creating some sort of sense of physiological safety in my body? Because that's what it comes down to, right? When you're overwhelmed, people do all kinds of things, disassociate or become overly aggressive. Like however you deal with it, you have patterns.
Yeah, I've talked to some other people in the military, and it's fascinating to me how, and I think this is changing. You could probably speak to this, that most of the training is very task specific, right? And it's almost sort of the opposite of the world not in the military, right? So you have like high level people who are trained via scenarios to react in a positive sort of way in stressful situations. And then over time, because of the stress inoculation, threat inoculation, their body gets better at performing under those circumstances, which is exactly 100% what you want because you're going to be putting them into that situation. So they have to be prepared for that. I remember a former Navy SEAL came out and was telling me, he's like, yeah, the first time I went to the grocery store after I got done by myself, it freaked me the fuck out. And I'm just like, well, you said he was so used to being in a stressful environment and having everything very regimented that the thought for him just to go into a store with other people in a non-threatening environment, he realized he understood that it was not threatening, but he could feel that he had a lot of anxiety around it, which for me was like interesting because you're almost sort of like, in his case, he was sort of flip-flopped, right? He was good in high stress situations, but he just got out and he wasn't adapted yet to situations without having that stress. Where I think most people are the inverse, right? If you drop them in a high stress situation, it's probably not going to go so well just because they're not used to it.
Totally. Yeah. And so kind of to tie into the topic here, like really what's happening oftentimes is you're constantly sympathetic, right? You're
Yep.
constantly alert. You're constantly fight or flight. I remember after I got out of the military, I have insomnia like you read about. And I remember laying in bed, and you're frustrated, can't go to sleep. And I was checking my heart rate, and it was like 135. And it's like,
Woo.
it's like midnight. There's nothing going on. There's no reason to be stressed. And so really what happens is, you inoculate yourself you become really good in stressful environments, and your body has a lot of trouble shifting gears, becoming parasympathetic again. And like, you can probably speak to this better than I can, but essentially, like, when you're in that sympathetic state, your body's using physiological resources at a very
Yeah.
rapid rate. And so you feel exhausted all the time. I heard it explained to me one time, like, it's a lot like just getting in your car and slamming on the gas and the brakes at the exact same time, right? Like, you're revved up, but you're not going anywhere. And so switching into a parasympathetic state is something that, again, like I was telling you pre-show, in the military, it became really important for me. And now, since getting out of the military, like, I'm always sort of paying attention to and regulating my physiological state. It's become really important. Yeah.
Do you think that's a skill set in terms of the military, and then we'll transition to non-military? Do you think that's a skill set that's being taught a little bit more now, and maybe allowing some people who are in high stress situations to, for lack of a better word, cope a little bit better once they are out and that situation is removed from their life?
Yeah, I mean, I think it probably depends on where you're at.
Sure.
I was really fortunate that I was at a special operations unit, and so we had a ton of money and a team of docs, a human performance lab. So I started gaining these tools toward the end of my career. But it's pretty difficult because, psyches are unraveling in the military left
Sure.
and right. And, when you think about like sort of Maslow's hierarchy, it's like the physiology just has to be taken care of. Like, I think a lot of times we're solving mental problems when it's a physiological problem. Because, right, I've been thinking about this a lot. The way in which your physiology changes the way you're experiencing reality.
Yes.
And so we could say that as a very easy way of thinking about that is like, when you become sympathetic, right, you have a heightened awareness. And so you're going to notice things that you wouldn't necessarily notice in a calm, relaxed place. Like, for most of my life, I haven't been able to go to a restaurant without trying to identify where all the exits are.
Yeah,
right? Like, it's just something you wouldn't pay attention to if you're in
Right.
like a calm, relaxed place. And so because it changes the way that you actually experience your reality, I think it's important to understand that it's kind of the baseline thing that you have to take care of, because you might be solving for the wrong problem, first of all. And so, in the military, I was lucky toward the end of my career. And, there's another trouble here too in the military, just since we're talking about it, which is you really can't have problems, right? You really can't have psychological problems. So you get really good at shoving things down inside. And like, I wrote a lot about this in my second book, but you don't get to repress things without them being expressed in some other way that you're actually just not in control of, right? And so, I remember when I started going over to the human performance lab, and since I was getting out, that's when you can be like, okay, so turns out I haven't slept in 10 years. Like, I have this going on and this going on. And so when I was going through that process, I remember that's when I started like going and doing meditation and breath work, and I started to really understand it. Yeah. Before that, breath work was all about performance, right? Like, for me, for example, I have a fear of heights, but like, I have 150 something jumps, right? I've jumped out of a helicopter a ton of times, and I never stopped being scared of it, right? That physiological response never happened. And so using a parasympathetic breath pattern or box breathing, that just didn't really work for me. But using something like that to regulate and increase performance was fine. But I just started in the end of my career learning that you could use it to actually proactively treat things.
Yeah, that's interesting because in college, they convinced me that I have a massive fear of heights also. And so idiot me goes, oh, if I jump out of a plane, that'll fix my fear of heights, right? Thinking that I'll overcome, the thing that's stressing me out. And I was in my master's program at the time, and in UP of Michigan, there was a place where you could do static line your first time. These are all just, civilians that just show up to this place. And we got enough people from our lab to go and do it. My roommate was, certified at the time. And for people who are listening, like static line, when they teach you, you have to hold on to a pull-up bar off the end of a plane because you're in a stable position. You're only at 3,000 feet, and you let go, and hopefully it pulls your chute, or if not, you've got to floor your other one right away. And I remember just being absolutely stressed out of my mind. Getting on the plane, the guy's like, we're leaking a little fuel out of the left side, but we won't be in the air that long. It's fine. And the plane just looked like a flying piece of shit. Like, there's no way I would have gotten this plane without, something on to jump out of it with a chute. And he's like, biggest guy out first. So I'm sitting by the door. And they're like, it's a beautiful day. We'll leave the door open. And I'm like, oh, my God. And I remember sitting there just crossed with my arms like this, like so afraid I was going to do something wrong. And he's like, okay, we're over the site, get out on the bar, right? So you stick your head out the window and you have to, crawl out to get onto this pull-up bar. And all I kept remembering was, okay, keep one hand moving in front of the next, one hand moving in front of the next. And it turns out the jump masters, like in my left ear, like screaming at me, get your ass in the bar, get your ass in the fucking bar. Because they're, only over the site for so long. It's trees and everything else around.
Right, over the drop zone, right?
Yep. So I finally get out in the bar, and there's a picture of me looking in. My eyes are like the size of Coke bottles. I'm like holding on by like 2 fingers. And I asked my roommate, I said, hey, what happens if I get out on this bar and I just freeze up? Like, I can't let go. And he's like, the jump master goes, I crawl out there and pull your fingers off one by one until you drop. And I'm like, what? He's like, because once you're on the bar, you can't get your ass back in the plane. So you're just going down. I was like, oh, okay. But, to your point about, elevated heart rate and like things that you remember, like when your heart rate gets so high, you just end up in this super state of like just hypervigilance. And I didn't remember him yelling in my ear. I didn't remember anything. I remember looking in the plane and like letting go. And then luckily everything worked out fine. You get down to the bottom. And again, I'm just like super freaked out. And he's like, okay, so prepare to flare, right? So you got your hands up. And so, as you know, but for the listeners, like if you flare too soon, your chute stalls out and then you just pummel into the ground. And if you flare too late, you just pummel into the ground. So I know in my head, I'm like, I got to do it at the right time. And he's like, all right, prepare to flare, and I'm ready. And the guy in the walkie-talkie goes, flare. And so I do it. And the guy in the walkie-talkie then goes, oh, shit. I'm like, uh-oh. And so idiot me looks down at the ground. I don't have depth perception anyway. And I just pummel into the ground, jam my knee up and stuff. And I asked him at the end, I said, hey, what happened? Like, why are you yelling like, oh, shit, over the radio? And he's like, that's the fastest I've seen anyone flare in my entire life. Because as you get into high heart rates, like some gross motor skills get, elevated. And so for me, it was super fascinating thinking back on what stress does and how it changes your perception. And then I also realized that didn't do anything to cure my fear of heights, and I never want to do that again, actually. So,
yeah, that it's such a good point. I think that a lot of people today, like fear management might be the thing that people are struggling with the most now in our current time. It's super important to me that people understand that fear doesn't go away. Like so many people wait for fear to go away, and it actually doesn't. You actually have to increase courage in relation to fear. That's how it works psychologically. And so, yeah, I think a lot of people, and that's true for like existential type fears. That's true for fear of failure. That's true for fear of heights, right? Physical fears. It's just true about fear. And so, yeah, the two important things I think are, one, fear, for example, changes the way you experience reality. You wouldn't make decisions that you would make otherwise if you weren't scared.
Yes.
And then at the same time, realizing that incrementally courage has to be increased in relation to fear. But some of those fears, like fear of heights, for example, is one that I'm thinking of. It's like, my courage went up, I guess, but like, I don't know.
You did it 150 times. You figured it out.
I also took flying lessons. I had a pretty rough sort of crash landing in Indonesia on a plane. And so after that, every single time I flew, I would break out and I would just be stressed out of my
Mm.
mind. I couldn't sleep. And so I was like, oh, I'll take flying lessons. Like I will face this head on. And, after about 25 hours of like white knuckling the steering wheel and sweating, I was just like, I hate this. I'm not doing this anymore. I'll do box breathing when I climb something high. That's fine. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think there's also a human nature to when you're just going to opt out and be like, hey,
Mm-hmm.
maybe this thing isn't really worth it, and I think that's an okay decision too, right? Because I think a lot of society almost pushes people the other direction of like, whatever your fear is, you got to overcome all of it and you got to make it your bitch and all this stuff. And I think that, like you said, there's a time and a place to elevate courage to overcome it. And I think there's also a time and a place to be just like, nah, I don't really want to do that. And I'm okay. Like, I'm okay with that decision too.
Totally. And you think about that, it's really rooted in some sort of false bravado because fear, just like any other emotion, is an informational input. It's trying to
Right.
tell you something like, hey, people like you have died doing things like this in the
Right.
past. Right. And so for you to be like, no, ignore all informational inputs and do what you want, like that's pretty bad advice too.
Yeah. Yeah. I know a fair amount of people who do, I wouldn't say extreme sports. I don't really like that term, but like big mountain skiing. I know you do a lot of skiing and snowboarding and stuff, and people that kiteboard and crazy wingsuit people. And looking at some of the stuff they do, you would think that like, oh, they don't really have any fear at all. But most of it, like you said, is managing fear, and then also setting. What you don't see is like the hundreds to sometimes thousands of hours of training where they're doing just a little bit more than before, just a little bit more before. They're getting a lot of experience doing those things and getting, I think, more accustomed to it. Not that it is going to mitigate or make all the fear go away, but I think they're much more prepared for it than what someone watching the outcome of a 10-second clip on YouTube realizes too.
Totally. And that is part of the reason that, like in the military, for example, all your immediate action drills, all your drills, it's all gross motor skills and you pattern the hell out of it,
Yes.
right? So that you can perform that pattern with or without the lights on, essentially.
Yeah, and I can't remember the saying, you probably know that you don't really rise to the occasion, you kind of fall to the level of your training.
Yeah, right. That's exactly right. Fall back on your training. Yeah. Because I remember the first time I was in a land warfare school learning about that, like your gun jams, it's 3 steps to get your gun unjammed, pretty much no matter what jam it is. And that's because we understand that what they called it in the military is like this chemical cocktail, right? One's adrenaline, and I can't remember all of the exact neurochemicals that are present, but essentially like you'll lose fine motor skills are essentially the first things that are going to go on you, right? And then processing power and things like that.
Yeah, I always explain it to people that if all of a sudden we're doing this podcast and a guy runs in my house with a gun, like my heart rate's going to elevate and everything in my brain, because you're survival orientated, is going to, like tunnel vision, right? Your goal is the immediate threat. Like you're not going to sit there, and if you were to try to, thread a needle, it's just not going to happen. But some gross motor skills are involved. You hear even, police reports of like did not hear gunshot fired behind him because there was a threat coming, towards an officer or even in the military, right? So I think, like you said, knowing that certain things are going to drop off, but gross motor skills are going to be enhanced. And if you've trained enough, you're just going to default to what your training is, and hopefully that's, adequate at that time. So.
Yeah, totally. And so here's something interesting too. Like someone comes in your house with a gun, as you were just saying, right? And so when that happens, you feel that fear response, right? And you're essentially gonna be on autopilot, but you're gonna make decisions based on that fear response. I think one way that we're not necessarily seeing how this is playing out in our lives is we're kind of constantly getting injects of fear now on social media, on the regular media, from friends. And because the world has been destabilized in some way, our sense of safety is gone. So more fear injects are coming, but we don't necessarily feel that fear. It's kind of like if I were to take 5 milligrams of morphine and just give you a bolus, right? Like you're going to feel that. You're going to be like, oh, here we go. And you're going to be high. But if I drip that same amount of morphine, or 5 grams, I think, over an hour, you're not going to feel it. But by the end of that hour, the end result's going to be the same.
Very gradual.
Right? But you won't feel the onset. Yeah. And so part of the work I've been doing in the last 6 months or so is helping people feel what that fear feels like in their body, because then what happens is you'll start to notice it in all of these little IV drips that you're getting throughout the day. And I think, I think it's important, if you want to have autonomy over your life, that you recognize how this fear is directing your actions, because it is changing the way you experience reality. You just might not be aware of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. And then, so my side note, which I got from a buddy of mine, Frankie Ferries, is that I think then you would want to be sensitive enough to act or to change the course, right? So I think what you're saying is, correct me if I'm wrong, is that you want enough sensitivity to know that that's occurring so you can take a different action then, correct?
Yes, right. Because fear is a type of possession, and that if you're scared of me, I could make you do whatever I want, right? You're possessed by me in some way. And so what happens is we don't feel the IV drip of fear. And so we end up making our decisions based on that fear without knowing that we're doing it. We're telling ourselves we're free, essentially, because the cage is so complete that we don't see it.
Yeah. That's super cool.
And I think that's why it's so important to understand that these things, when you're put into a sympathetic state, like it's changing the way you're seeing the world. It's shaking your snow globe up, right? And so having things like parasympathetic breath patterns, doing fear work, fear meditations, things like that, they're massively beneficial in just giving people more autonomy over their lives and the decisions that they're making.
Yeah. So what are some of the tools you would use? Because I agree with that, and I think society tends to be much more on the fear stress side. And what I find is with clients, trying to get them to downregulate is usually much harder than getting them to upregulate. So what are some tools that you found to help with downregulation or becoming more parasympathetic?
So, I mean, a basic parasympathetic breath pattern is the exhale is going to be double the length of the inhale. And so you can make that look like anything you want. And I tend to teach that because I think when it comes to tools, tricks, habits, like hacks, like all of those get lost. But you can sit down for 10 breath patterns and do 3 seconds in with a quick pause and then a 6-second out breath, right? And you'll find that if you ever try to do that, it's actually kind of got to be trained, because if you're real sympathetic and you just try to do that, you'll find that you can't. You'll find that it's
hard.
pretty tough to do. But that's something that you can train yourself to do as well. And I believe it was a study out of Georgetown that looked at that parasympathetic breath pattern and paired it directly after workouts and increased the rate of recovery from the people that were working out. Can you speak to that? So the idea was that after a workout, they were able to switch into a parasympathetic state and start that recovery process sooner. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, I mean, that's something I've had people do for a while. John Russin has some stuff on that too, and this kind of gets into transitions, right? So if you look at elite level athletes, they're able to do very fast transitions, right? If you look at the fastest human in a 100-meter run and sprint, it's to go from 0 to top end speed to not decelerating to crossing the line first, right? So whether it's NFL, you're doing change of direction drills, right? Everything is a very fast transition, appears to be beneficial. So I would extend that and say, okay, once you're done, there's no need to be, super sympathetic after you're done lifting. If you can downregulate and do that faster. My buddy Dave Barrs also talked about this too, where and it's funny, I ended up doing the same thing before talking with him. So lay down and put your feet up, your arms out at your side. Just try to get in a very relaxed state. Not much sensory input coming in, if at all possible. And I usually do what you said, longer exhale. And then you can get fancy, use like an Oura ring and look at HRV measurements or heart rate or whatever. And usually you find that I just noticed anecdotally with clients that they're just a lot better the next day. HRV stress usually isn't as high. And then the last part too is that you can get fancy and exercise and measure heart rate recovery, right? It's just get to an elevated heart rate and then stop. How long does it take you? 1 or 2 minutes, there's different time periods to get back to baseline, right? So the faster you can get back to baseline, you have better heart rate recovery, you have better parasympathetic reactivation after a stressful event.
Yeah, I did some stuff like that with Brian McKenzie one time, and I
Oh,
can't
nice.
remember the exact nature of it, but we were like packing breath and then doing sprints on the Airdyne. And so we did sprints on the Airdyne, say like, I think 1 or 2 minutes. So probably like 90% effort or max cals in a minute, something like that. And then we looked at like how long it took our recovery or our heart rate to return to baseline. And then we packed oxygen and did the same thing and found that just being more oxygenated on our own allowed us to drop back down into a recovery rate faster. So that was interesting too.
So what was the technique to be more oxygenated? Were you doing like a hyperventilation type technique
A
then, or?
hyperventilation, yeah,
Okay.
exactly. Yep, and holding it, and then so essentially, like, yeah, you're hyperventilating, you're holding the inhale, and you're almost doubling the inhale to the exhale. Does that make sense? So instead
So you
of
invert it. Got it.
invert it, yeah, exactly.
Very cool. Yeah, that's awesome. I'm just gonna pop my video off here for a sec, just because I think it's getting kind of funky. So we'll see if that helps it. Yeah. Any other techniques? Any other breath techniques you found that have been useful?
So in tandem with that study, I'm not sure what your thoughts on meditation are. I've started meditating, but I also know that when I first tried to start meditating, it was damn near impossible,
Yes,
and it
that
took
was
me
my
a really
experience.
long time. But something like the Headspace app, where you can do like a guided, where they actually talk you through it.
Mm-hmm.
So in tandem with that study, like they looked at breath work, parasympathetic breath patterns, and they also looked at meditation, and meditation seemed to have the exact same effect. And so what I started doing at first, and this is what I had clients do for a while when I was coaching, is I would have them queue up like a 5 or 10 minute guided meditation. And then same thing, like you were saying, like cut down the sensory input. So I would just have them finish the workout and then just shut the lights off, lay down,
Yeah.
close their eyes, but then just follow the guided meditation. And that is pretty easy to do. And just subjectively, it seemed to be that people felt a lot better.
Yeah, I'll have them do that, or belly breathing. For myself, I usually change the music, because music for me is like a big indicator. Yeah, all those things help. I've even gone so far as, if in a perfect world, like on a Sunday night or Sunday, if that's my off day, if I can do like a 60 or 90-minute flow tank, which I haven't been able to do for about the last year and a half, but just do some breath work in there and just literally remove as many sensations as possible. My HRV is usually better. I've looked at some stuff on Omega Wave with like DC potential or CNS type stuff, and that normally normalizes quite a bit too. But it's kind of the same idea. You're just removing as much sensory input as you possibly can.
Yep. I started doing, after all the ultra marathons that I would run, I started scheduling a float like the following day.
Oh, nice.
And I felt like, I mean, this is of course subjective, but it
Sure.
felt to me like it pushed my recovery along by about 3 days.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it was massively beneficial, to the point where it like became something that I made sure that I did. Yeah.
Yeah, when I was doing a lot more live presentations, I had my assistant look for a float tank area. And so if I would get done presenting Sunday night, I would usually book one there that evening if I could. And then I would normally allow Monday as an off day and then fly back on Tuesday. And it's, again, anecdotal, but that made like a huge difference, because for quite a while I would, get there a day before because I always got nervous about something happening with the flight or whatever, do the thing, the 2-3 days, whatever it was, and then, fly out immediately, come back and expect to work, a full day on Monday. And yeah, that didn't go so well after a while.
Yeah. And I don't know. So do you notice that after you present that you're pretty exhausted?
Yeah, it's gotten better, but like I've done 3 and 4 days, just me only. And it's one of those weird things. Even 2-day ones are, it's like I love doing it. It's super fun, but man, by the time it's done, like I'm toast. I'm just,
Totally.
yeah.
Right. So your body is like, I mean, you're essentially sympathetic for that period. And
Yeah.
that's because it, like, I mean, you can talk to this perhaps, but I think it increases your your ability to compute. It increases your cognitive function by being in that sympathetic state. You can grab ideas quicker. You can find things faster. And it's probably just a response to nerves as well. But I think it's important to recognize, like, so much of our life today is inherently sympathetic.
Yes.
Right? Like, we're almost always on. And like, everything in the world is rhythmic, right? It's seasonal, and that's including us. And at the same time, though, we don't really obey winter, right? Like, these normal times where we would be more parasympathetic and sleep more, that's really not the case anymore with screens and with the modern world. Like, everything is just inherently sympathetic. And so I think that this issue is actually across the board, whether people are in the military or not. Our jobs are inherently sympathetic. I was talking to one of my clients yesterday who gets 500 emails a day. It's like,
Oof.
That you're just ramped on all the time, and like, to what I said earlier, you're just using physiological resources at a really rapid rate, right? For 5 or 10 years, it's exhaustion, but then it's going to start to manifest physically for sure.
Yeah. And similar to what you said, I actually like presenting a little bit more in that sympathetic state, but I also realize, like, during break periods, if I had a little bit of downtime, that I would try to downregulate during that time was good. And then also what was going on in the evening, I would be more cognizant of scheduling that kind of stuff. Where I think when I first started, I'm like, oh, but I don't want to be that person that, like, just disappears after the seminar is over, and because I enjoy the process. But then I also started looking to see, if I got one this weekend and one the following weekend, and sometimes it's a plane ride or different country, whatever. It's like, okay, I can do one night out, and then the rest of the nights I'm just going to disappear into my hotel room.
What do you do to downregulate?
What I found was, like, the float tanks at the end were super beneficial. Some light exercise was beneficial. If I didn't have to work as much, what I got better at doing was I would go to bed super early, and then I would get up early. I would do email client stuff in the morning, and then I would go teach. Because I found trying to do that in the evening prevented me from getting to bed early. And then I also, if it was short, like a 3 to 4 day one, I wouldn't turn my time clock different. So especially if it was on the West Coast, it'd be like about a 2-hour difference. I would stay on Central Time for 4 days.
Great idea.
Yeah, because I'm like, well, I would just, because I could adjust my schedule around it. As long as I was doing the presentation on time, everything was cool. So depending on what coast I was on or where I was at, a lot of times it would look like, getting done with it and then literally being in bed by 8, but then I would get up at, 5 or 4 in the morning, and just not having to switch those couple hours I found made like a big difference. And then the other part I noticed too, and maybe you noticed this too, is that long plane flights, no matter how much I got up and moved around, even if they were in the same time zone, man, those would just kind of wreck me for about a day. And if I had to flip time zones, it was even worse.
Yeah, right. Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just traveling in general, I think is, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you can also sort of, I'm not 100% sure how I would describe this, but you can also sort of cause an acute tension, and then that will allow you to release into a more parasympathetic place as well. So kind of like a cold shower at night, for example,
yes.
Right? A cold shower is it's going to make you sympathetic, like you're going to tighten up. You're going to, at the same time though, it's almost like you get to release that energy, and then you'll sleep better.
Yes.
Have you noticed that?
Yeah, I've played around with that because I have a freezer in my garage that we've converted into cold water immersion, which is kind of fun. And I've done it a few times in the evening, and it's pretty much like what you said. Because the first time I read some of the studies on that, they're kind of split. But people are like, oh, no, it's the temperature difference. And you're like, what? I don't know. I don't want to get like super sympathetic before bed. But what I would find is I would be awake for half hour, 45 minutes, and then I would get a lot more tired. Like you said, it was like changing the shape of the curve, which I thought was interesting. And the handful of times I've been able to do it with sauna or heat, I find that heat, for me personally, was even better. Yeah,
Really?
because
That's interesting.
it's weird because like even like I'd measure my heart rate to be 120, 130, 135. You get done and I would just feel like super relaxed. We did that when we were in Finland a lot. We would place we were staying at. We're there for a grip competition, and the place we were staying at had like 3 saunas. It's like, oh, which sauna are we gonna go to tonight? And that was great. So we take a sauna late at night to get done, take a cool shower, and man, I was out like right after that, right away. So
Yeah, I bet. Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, it sounds like it would be counterintuitive,
right,
but it certainly works. Yeah.
yeah. On the other end of the spectrum, if people want to upregulate their sympathetic, maybe before a stressful event or training or something like that, what are some things you would recommend?
Yeah, so that's interesting. I don't know that I've ever met someone that has trouble becoming more sympathetic. Like I can just tell you like that you're gonna like you have a meet in an hour and that will make you
Yeah.
sympathetic, right? And so I mean like of course there's caffeine and the normal things that you would do, but I don't know that I've ever for my whole life it's been me learning how to become parasympathetic. Um, so that's interesting. Yeah. What would you use to push people into that state? I mean, you can use breath pattern for that as well.
Yeah.
Right. You can use, I mean, you could do this right now, or you could mimic a panic attack and just make your breath short and
Right.
rapid. And that will cause a sympathetic state. I don't know that I would have people do that, but
Yeah, I've played around with that. I know Patrick McEwen has some stuff on that, like as a more warm up before exercise. I think Brian McKenzie has some stuff there too. And I've played around with it a little bit, but I haven't used it a whole lot. There's another study looking at hyperventilation before exercise and looking at performance. And there's some interesting studies even doing it during weightlifting. But man, the amount of people I trust to do that under load is like almost nobody. I don't even trust myself to really do that because the consequence if you go too far under load just sounds like a really horrible idea. I know some people were saying like, oh, we'll just do it with deadlifts. So if it happens, you just drop the weight. But I don't know if I want to be dropping weight and potentially passing out. And I don't know. So
right.
I think there's a fine line there. And even in the studies, there wasn't that much of a performance benefit, because it's similar to you. I think most people, even when I was doing studies in the lab, like, most people, if they were competitive at all, they were, pretty good to go. We had a couple of people that, they probably could have cared less. But yeah, I usually found that it's the downregulation side that people are missing too.
Yeah, and I find that like 3 rounds of Wim Hof will put you at a pretty even place as well. So
Yes.
that's sort of sympathetic in a sense because you're holding your breath and you're kind of like forcing oxygen. But interestingly enough, if you're anxious, if you have something sort of psychosomatic that's making you sympathetic, will actually put you in like a pretty even keel place. And I find that what's good about that is because it's more forceful, it gives you something to do that it's a little bit easier than trying to slow your breathing pattern down. And so again, it sounds a little counterintuitive, but because you are taking these deep breaths and you're kind of forcing oxygen in and out, but it'll put you in a pretty good place as well. And it's a little bit easier to get to from a really sympathetic place.
Yeah, that's what I find. I mean, I had tried off and on to do breathwork meditation stuff since I read one of Andrew Weil's book in like 1996, and to my brain, I'm like, okay, I'm not doing the habit enough, tiny habits like BJ Fogg stuff. I got to just make the habit smaller and smaller. And, I was at the point where I'm trying to do like 30 seconds of meditation, and I just was like, God, this is worthless. Like nothing ever happens. I don't feel any different. Like what the hell? And then I did a barbell mastermind, God, probably 5 years ago now. And Mike Bledsoe read us through some stuff using a Wim Hof method, was on the beach in Mexico. And I'm like, okay, if I can't figure out how to do meditation here, like paying a lot of money to hang out on a beach in Mexico to have somebody guide me through it, I'm probably never going to figure it out. Right. And it was just basically a Wim Hof style technique. And what I realized was, like when you're doing a breath hold and you're not even breathing and you're like, oh, this is what calm feels like. Oh, weird. Oh, wow. Like I could I actually felt something from putting the work in, even after just a couple rounds. So similar to what you said, I do that with clients now, even if they're very sympathetic, just to be like, okay, so when you're doing this breath hold, like this is what calm actually feels like. Because if you do like 2-3 rounds even during the breath hold, like everything gets really quiet. And you're like, oh, this is kind of what I'm looking for. Oh, okay, got it. Right. And then I'll back people back from that or wherever they want to go next.
Yeah, I think for the Western mind, something like that's great because it gives you something to do, right? The hardest part of meditation is that you don't know what to do. You don't have something in front of you. But a breath pattern like that is great because you can follow it. It's not too difficult. And so that's kind of my go-to before I speak, before I present. I'll do like 3 rounds of Wim Hof, and then I'll just end with 5 seconds of a sympathetic breath pattern, or I'm sorry, 5 cycles of a sympathetic breath pattern. And I feel great. I'm like, oh, found center. We're here. Okay, perfect.
So the sympathetic pattern, are you just doing more of a rapid inhale, let go then?
I'm sorry. I always do that. Parasympathetic.
Oh, okay.
No, at the end, I'll just do 5 breaths of like 3 seconds in, 6 seconds out.
Got it.
And I'll end with that. And then I feel like whatever nerves I was thinking about, like it all just seems to like put me in a really even keeled place.
Yeah. No, I agree with that. I find that what I call the Zen style, go stare at a tree, like to be really hard. I think it's incredibly beneficial. And a friend of ours, Mr. Kim, we've taken some meditation retreats from him. He's a Zen priest, and it's super interesting to me how that is so simple to explain. Okay, just find a soft point out in front. Yep, just look at it. Just watch your thoughts as they come and go. Okay, Mr. Kim, what else do we do? That's it. That's it. Yeah, go do. Okay.
Right. Yeah, like you'd be more comfortable if he gave you like a list of 8, list of 8 things to do at once. That's the Western mind for sure.
Yeah.
And I don't know what I think we've talked about this a little. I can't recall your thoughts on nasal breathing during cardio, but I also find that it's easy for us to, outwork our own fitness, like when it comes to cardio, running, things like that. Mm-hmm. And so we're just sort of in this really ramped up sympathetic place, mouth breathing like crazy, trying to like get oxygen in. And so I found too that like switching to nasal breathing for all of your long, slow distance LSD cardio type stuff. It's frustrating to watch your mile times go down, but in the long run, like your recovery and everything is just so much better if you can like get pushed through the mental part of it.
Yeah. I found that that's been huge. I mean, probably maybe 3.5 years ago now, I started doing, I had a bunch of CrossFit people who were just beating themselves into a bloody pulp. And then they hired me, and I'm like, okay, now just don't beat yourself into a bloody pulp, and then they'd still do it. So I'm like, okay, so how do I get them to do something that's really hard that just doesn't beat the crap out of them and actually helps their performance because their aerobic base was kind of low, the ones I was working with. So I'm like, okay, go do a 5K on the Concept 2 rower and only breathe through your nose and tape your mouth if you have to. They're like, what? I'm like, no, just go do it. They all come back, and they go. One guy's like, oh my God, I'm drowning in air. But his max heart rate was only 111, so it got him to not hit max all the time, but it felt hard, right? So they loved doing things that felt hard, so they were kind of bought into it. And when I started doing it, same thing. Like I found, like with rowing or even running, like trying to get in that rhythmic thing where your breath is kind of matching your pace or your stroke or whatever, like kind of hard to do and kind of maddening, but if you can do it, like when I got done, I'm like, oh, I can think again. Oh, the world's a nice place again. It's okay.
Yeah, it is a little bit maddening. I'm not sure if I ever told you that I use nasal breathing for those reasons. I also really like the mental push of it. Like I do an hour on the air bike, nasal breathing only for max cals. Like that'll put you in a dark place.
Oh yeah.
And for the first 200 miler that I ever ran was in Lake Tahoe. So, it's between 6,000 and 10,000 feet elevation, but I lived in Virginia Beach and I was in the military. So I couldn't even travel to train. And so I had to train at sea level. Well, then I go to the race and I get to mile 89 and I'm like starting to spit up blood. And then by mile 93, I can't, as I talk, it sounds like I'm like gargling water.
Oh.
And I know that if I go talk, so I'm like in this place where I'm like, okay, if I talk to and I'm a medic, so I'm pretty well aware of what's going on here. So I'm like, okay, if I talk to, anybody at the aid station, they're not going to let me finish this race. They're going to pull me. I think they pull 4 or 5 people per year for high altitude pulmonary edema.
Yep.
And then I also couldn't lay down to sleep like at the aid stations or anything because it felt like I was drowning if I laid down.
Yep.
So I was like, man, I really don't know what to do here. And so I was kind of walking, like trying to figure it out, trying to like get my mind around like, how do I get through this race? I still have 110 miles to go or something.
Jesus.
Yeah, terrible. And I started thinking about it. And I was like, well, I trained so much nasal breathing that I was like, man, I wonder if I could manage this. So I took some vasodilators, which seemed to help a little bit. And then I just switched to nasal breathing for like the next 70 miles. And it was maybe it was just that my pace was slow enough that I was able to process oxygen. But for whatever reason, like it saved my race. It got me through there. I basically just had to not ever stay at any aid station that was above like 7,000 feet. And as soon as I would come down below 7,000 feet, my lungs would clear up and I would feel fine.
Oh, wow.
And so, yeah, it was a very interesting and painful experience. Oof. But yeah, nasal breathing got me through it.
Huh, interesting. Do you think part of that is also maybe the association you had with nasal breathing also, just from the neuro association?
Yeah, it has to be, right? I mean, I've thought a lot about this because it really worked. Because I couldn't run more than 10 feet without like doubling over and coughing up blood.
Oh, wow.
And for whatever reason, when I switched to nasal breathing, I mean, it was slow, but it worked.
Oh, that's super interesting. Like I just think there's so much of the mental side of training that we haven't even scratched the surface of. Right, and that gets into whole, Tim Noakes' central governor theory, which you could probably never prove or disprove of. His whole premise was, okay, so if it's all just simply as distal peripheral fatigue, why does every big race people get faster at the end? Right, when you have the most fatigue on board, why do people speed up? You're like, oh, shit, that's a good question.
Totally. Yeah, you're right. You couldn't prove or disprove it, but to say that your mind is limiting your ability to perform, I don't think we have to have a long conversation about.
Yeah.
Right. Because I mean, even, CrossFit athletes experience this, I think, like you train that governor in your ability to go hard. That's why CrossFit never gets easier.
Right.
Because not only do you get fitter, but you get better at like exerting yourself. And so you go further into the pain cave.
Yeah. I have clients who yell at me. They're like, my max 2K times in the rower have gotten better, but they never feel any easier. I'm like, they never will, right? The same reason, right? Yeah. You're just able to push harder and you're doing more, so it's always going to feel just miserable. It just is.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for the conversation and sharing everything. I really appreciate it. It I think gives us some good tools to definitely use. For people who want to find more about you, where should they go? I highly recommend your latest book. I bought it and sent it to all my clients, and I love it. I think it's just really well done.
Man, thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate that. Appreciate you buying it for your clients.
Yeah, totally.
And for having me on. I think the place I'm the most active is on Instagram at @RickAlexander_. And the book that you're talking about is Ambitious Heroes and Heartache, and that's available on Amazon.
Yeah, I would highly recommend it. It's really good. A lot of really good lessons in there, and it's nice to read. I've been forcing myself to go through it kind of slow, about 3/4 of the way through. So I'll read a chapter and then just kind of think on it and kind of process that. And when I feel like I've got a fair amount out of it, then I'll move on to the next chapter. So it's been super useful.
Thanks. Yeah, I've heard that. I've heard that it's so packed that it takes a bit to process.
Yeah, which is a good thing. I can't say that about a lot of books. Like the books you just read through it and you're like, meh, I'm done with that. Yeah, probably not so impactful.
Right. Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for listening to the Flex the Diet podcast. Really appreciate it. Big shout out. Thanks to Rick for taking the time out to chat. Always enjoy chatting with him. Always learn new stuff too. I would highly encourage you to pick up his book. Check him out on Instagram and his podcast. Also, we'll have all the links here. As I mentioned in the intro, this is brought to you by the Physiologic Flexibility Cert. You can go to physiologicflexibility.com and you'll have more information there. You'll be able to get on the wait list also for the next time that we open it. If you're looking for a complete system that includes both the context, the big picture, a technical rundown of the components, and over 40 specific action items of what you would do with all that material, check out the physiologicflexibility.com. So that'll put you on the wait list there for the next time that the certification opens up. Also, make sure to check out all of Rick's great stuff and give us a rank and a review on whatever your favorite podcast platform is. Really appreciate it. It helps us get into the ear holes of more people. Spread the good word. Thank you so much again for listening. Really appreciate it. Talk to you all soon.